Hey there, this is Erica from Ever Educating, and this channel is teaching tips, tools, ideas, and resources for new college instructors. This month's theme is course design from a very big picture sense. So today we're covering a more static course design approach, and then in 2 weeks we'll discuss a more flexible or fluid course design approach. So it really depends on various factors which approach I would recommend. So we're going to go through, I'll explain each, and then you can decide which approach works best for you. Now, both of these approaches to course design start in the same place, and that is figuring out what are your course objectives for your students. What should your students be able to do by the end of your course? Because you know that in order to make any plans for what to teach, right? What do you want them to be able to do? But when you're thinking of a static approach to course design, this means that you could potentially design your whole course before the course even begins. So you go in and your semester is much lighter in work because all you're doing is grading and teaching, and you're not having to actually plan what's happening next week, what's happening in a month. There's none of that because all of that has already been decided in advance. So with this approach, you're gonna know, okay, you have your objectives, all right? Now you kind of figure out what are gonna be your major projects. Once you know that, you figure out, okay, so what's gonna be a theme with a topic of each of the weeks in the course, and then you keep on going, right? So once you have that, you start creating the small activities. Once you know those, you curate the lectures, and then by the end of the course design experience, you now have a fully fledged course. So when the semester begins, you already have, okay, here's week 1, I've already created all the materials, now you just teach it. Here's week 2, and so on and so forth. So this one requires a lot more time in the early days, right, the pre-semester. But like I said, during the term, it's much less time on your end because after you teach the material, then again, all you're doing is answering any student questions and grading any student work. You're not researching new articles to share. You're not planning different activities. You're not trying to figure out, okay, what can I do for this particular batch of students that will interest them when it comes to next week's lecture, okay? So in this case, if you're someone who knows you're gonna have a super busy semester and lesson planning is gonna go by the wayside, then having this more static approach of doing everything beforehand is probably your best route. Sure, you can still tweak things here or there. It's not like you're required to stick to the static and never do anything different. You might find that you have a lighter week of your own personal things, your own research things, and so you can find an intriguing article that matches the topic of the week during the week. But that's not, the main part of this course design approach. The main part is, okay, if you're using an LMS, I'm gonna actually build out every single week before the semester begins. Maybe you hide the future weeks, right? So you lock them so students can't access them. But as you go from week to week, okay, we arrived at week 1, I'm teaching it face-to-face. I'm gonna reveal, Tuesday's activities so that when Tuesday comes and I teach, it's ready to go for students. Then Thursday, then next Tuesday, then next Thursday. Or again, up to you. You might decide, open the whole week at a time, or just have it all open. In that sense, the risk there, if you're teaching in person, you might have students going way ahead of you and asking questions about things that aren't really relevant yet. So if you have that worry, then you do potentially want to do that. You open it as you're actually teaching versus having it all open. Now, if you're teaching online, if you're teaching asynchronously, then potentially having it open appeals to you, okay? Or having it unit by unit, but maybe week by week, right? So I do have a video about that I'll link below. But this is the approach here, right? So it's having everything set in advance. Something to keep in mind here is just because it's static, right? Everything's planned beforehand, doesn't mean you can't have current events during the term become relevant in the course. Because you can plan for that in advance, okay? You might have, okay, I'm gonna have a discussion prompt. The prompt is gonna be find an article from a journal, find an article from online, find whatever from this week, this month, this year, and using that resource to answer these questions. So in that sense, you can have that really relevant, okay, this is a news story from yesterday that you are referencing in your discussion, and you're playing that in advance. So I do recommend this if you're taking this more static approach, is figuring out where can you include relevant material that's happening in the now once the course actually launches. So in this case though, you're asking the students to do that research, right? So it's part of their, learning of their research skills, their analytical skills, their compilation skills, whatever it is you're trying to teach them, right? Then you can have them do that work as part of an assignment in your course. Now, of course, again, like I said, you could potentially do this too. It's not like you have to stick to everything that you decided on before the term began. But, again, for your purposes here, you'll want to keep that to a minimum so you can figure out, okay, so maybe a discussion prompt requires this. Maybe there's a major assignment where they have to find 3 resources that came out about X topic in the past, again, month or year or whatever the case may be. It depends on what you're teaching, right? Because if you're teaching astronomy, right, then you might decide, like, yes, I want you to find articles, newspaper editorials, whatever the case may be, that are coming out now about new things being discovered out there in space, okay? So that's potentially one tip of how to make it a bit more fluid without you doing that work, right? It's part of the student assignments. Another tip along these lines is that when you're having discussions about the topics that you're teaching that you've already planned, before the term began, you ask for examples from the current situation. Okay, so if you're teaching sociological concepts, you have that lecture, that you created 3 months ago, but you're asking, hey, give me an example of this in the news now. Give me an example of this in, the past 5 years, how something has changed. Connect that to this concept that we just discussed. So again, in that sense too, you're asking questions that make the course more relevant to the students' lives today because you are referencing it in your questions to them. So that's another approach as well. Like if you don't want to do the more research heavy, like added to an assignment, it can just be part of your discussion. Hey, whenever we discuss these concepts, when we apply them to examples, I want you to be using examples from today's environment, from today's cultural moment. So a few things to consider here. If you're taking this more static approach, again, you're going to have the course objectives, the assignments, the activities, the lessons, all the materials, all created, all planned out, potentially placed in your LMS. So that's even less work for you when the term begins, rather than having it in a separate folder or all over your laptop and then having to find it week by week. I recommend just having it all built out very, concisely before the term begins. But other things you might want to consider is like, do you really have everything that you need? So are you going to create rubrics for your assignments? Because again, that can decrease the amount of time spent grading, though there are pros and cons for having rubrics. So it really depends on your approach to grading. But that's something to consider, along with the materials, with the assignment instructions, is do you have ways to make grading faster and for students to see like, hey, this is how you're going to be assessed when it comes to these assignments. Now, you also want to consider what potential bumps in the road you might have when you take this approach. So for example, if you've collected videos on YouTube or podcast episodes or things like that, things online to use as resources, then there's always the potential that that video will no longer exist by the time that week comes around in your course. Or that podcast is taken down because something went wrong with the podcast creators, okay? So in that sense, I do recommend having at least a short amount of time each week where you check, okay, let me make sure all the resources that I created are still functioning as they should. And if they're not, I'll replace it before the course, the next class begins. So there is still some of that work of course design that needs to be done during the term, but again, it's a lot less than the more fluid approach, which we'll cover in 2 weeks. So pros and cons, right? This might be for you, again, if you're really constrained on time, or if you like being super prepared for teaching, then this is probably the approach you want to take. So I hope, if it is, that you found this video helpful. Click like to let me know, and comment if you have your own advice if you're taking this more static approach, so you can share it with others as well. I'll see you next time with a new video. Subscribe to not miss out on that new video on course design in a couple weeks.